So Troy Davis's fate was decided by this group of people. This group of people is the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. They were the last ones who had any power to commute his sentence, right? And, you know, again, that group, so its proceedings are closed, they're limited. We've put in Freedom of Information requests to find out what happened there. We don't know. What we do know is that Officer McPhail's family did, in fact, testify, and they testified, and they were quite vociferous in their concern and determination that Troy Davis be executed. So I want to be clear. There's no question but that the victims of violent crimes suffer incredible loss and injury, and, you know, our hearts should go out to them, and we should certainly be concerned about their loss and their feeling. However, I want to turn now to thinking about something that's related to how we view witnesses. And I want to introduce the notion of implicit bias. A couple of things about implicit bias. First of all, it's fairly common. How many of you know what implicit bias is? Okay, that's interesting. It's almost as many as, I mean, I feel like I didn't know some of the stuff that you had. So, you know, implicit bias simply is the notion that we all operate with schemas that organize information in ways about which we are not conscious. And you know, the work on implicit bias that I'm referring to has to do with the way we organize that information along race, gender, age, and we tend to kind of have these schemas that categorize people in certain ways, and we actually then act on them. And it often conflicts with our conscious attitudes. We can have very progressive or enlightened, or what we think of as tolerant attitudes, but there are these things operating in our unconscious that, in fact, operate against that. Excuse me. So again, so a couple of other things. It's unintentional but powerful associations that we have. They can be they're elicited automatically without our knowing it, and they operate in milliseconds. They operate incredibly quickly. And they are supported by actually what goes on in our society and the things that, you know, in the media and in our educational system and in our language. Now, again, I want you to look. This is another photograph of Troy Davis. And you may remember, I don't think I mentioned that one of the things about Troy Davis was one witness testified that he had a smile on his face when he pulled the trigger. Again, these people, it was dark, people couldn't really see. But that really stuck. And so the prosecution made a big deal of the fact that this cop killer had a smirk on his face when he killed Officer McPhail. And one of the things about implicit bias work that's very interesting, it shows us that in point of fact, they've done research on showing these kinds of pictures and trying to think about people's perception of when an expression turns from a grimace to a smile. And consistently, the research shows that that judgment is made much sooner for whites than for blacks. In other words, we tend to see a white as smiling much more quickly, much more readily convinced of the change from one attitude to another for whites. And that's important when we think about kind of this question of Troy Davis smirking. Another thing I'll say is that there's another explanation for, well, I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so another thing is this question of reporting bias, all right? And again, this is important because we are talking about a case that went before a board of 3 white and 2 black parole board members who were hearing from witnesses about the need to kill Troy Davis, okay? And there are a couple of things about the implicit bias research that's important to know. A, they're based on extensive studies that are very kind of scientifically validated. And we know that we actually misremember facts in very subtle ways. And so we're able to, and once we've misremembered those facts, it becomes part of our reality, and we incorporate it, and we act on it, and it becomes, to some extent, self-perpetuating. So an example of that is that after one of Troy Davis's appeals was denied, a man was interviewed who said that he remembered seeing a picture of Troy Davis arrested with that smile on his face and the gun in his hand, right? And he said that in the press. Now, I don't think I said earlier, there was no gun, right? Troy Davis, there was absolutely no evidence in this case except for eyewitness testimony. Yet this man distinctly remembered seeing a picture of Troy Davis arrested with his gun. And again, that's a kind of way of misremembering. The other thing is that when Troy Davis was arrested, he in fact he turned himself in because he had been told the police were out to get him and kill him. And in fact, some people say that in fact, to the extent that he was smiling when he was arrested, he was smiling at the police because they had not been able to kill him. So the other thing that I want to think about in terms of this Board of Pardons and Paroles is this kind of question of empathy, okay, unconscious race empathy, which is to say, you know, we're likely to be inclined to remember things and hear things in relation to a level of empathy that we might have for those who look like us and think like us. So again, you know, I'll say it, I'll tell you so. So another issue that we face here is that the greatest predictor for the imposition of the death penalty in this country continues to be the race of victim. And I think Rachel will talk a little bit about that going forward. But the fact of the matter is that what happened to Troy Davis is consistent, and particularly consistent in Georgia, where you have a white victim and regardless of the race of the defendant. So at the same time, we have entire communities of color, including Savannah, Georgia, that are going lacking for resources and wanting for public safety. And it forced us to pose these questions. These questions actually organize our thinking. And you know, these are in fairly stark terms, and you can read them for yourselves. The issue is, how do we address these things? And at the time that we first became involved in the Troy Davis work, we thought that one of the ways was that all of this internet activity would in fact help us, help people to choose differently, would help convince people to make different choices. And you know, last night we spoke at 9th Street Baptist Church in Covington, as part of our effort to kind of try to think about how to get people to choose differently, right? And on some level, I continue to be optimistic about that prospect. But on another level, I'm concerned that there are severe limits on the extent to which the internet can, in fact, interrupt this racial contract with which we are haunted in this country, whether by traditional means or the new media. After Troy Davis's execution, we at the Institute issued a statement. And I don't know if you know that the same day that Troy Davis was killed, Lawrence Brewer was also executed for the murder of James Byrd. Now, how many of you know who James Byrd was? So James Byrd was famously murdered and tortured by three men in what was clearly and admittedly on their part a racially motivated crime. James Byrd's family pleaded with the state of Texas not to execute his murderer, and they went ahead and did it. So on the same day, you had two African-American families pleading for the lives of one white and one black, both of whom were killed. The pleas of those black families were not heard. So I'll conclude with a passage from this statement that we issued, which is, what we object to and will continue to fight against is the misappropriation of the legal system to meet personal desires for vengeance while simultaneously failing to meet the basic needs of our communities. We believe in and will continue to fight for the basic principle that the United States can become the inclusive community its founding documents so eloquently and persuasively promise. To reach that goal requires diligent and vigilant commitment to balancing the overall needs of communities with individual rights. And obtaining that balance means ensuring that the voices of those so long excluded from the public forum are heard and honored. Until that happens, as so many have declared in recent weeks, we are all Troy Davis. I'll conclude by saying, as John Powell has noted about implicit bias, it doesn't make us racist, it makes us human. The question is what we do as humans to counter it. and it remains to be seen whether and how new media might begin to attack such biases and the structures they support. Thank you.